Thanks very much. Thank you for hosting me, for inviting me here. I'm very excited to talk to you about what is the hottest topic in the media, and that is millennials. And the only topic that is hotter than that is if we were going to talk about millennials and boomers at exactly the same time, and that's what we're going to do today. So I'm going to demo for you a piece of software that the Census Bureau released in December of last year called Census Explorer. And the goal of this project was to be able to look at change in generations across time at a local level. It's not just enough for us to talk about changes at the national level. We have powerful demographic and economic trends that are shaping the country, but when we talk about them at the national level, we lose some of that local story for how our individual neighborhoods and cities have changed over time. So what I'm going to do is give you a setup of the national story first, and then take you into Census Explorer and talk a little bit about the changes at the local level. And hopefully, Census Explorer is a tool that you can use to bring to some of your stakeholders or some of the staffers that you meet with, something that you can show them that's visually compelling to show them how their local area has changed. Now, we all know the difference between millennials and boomers. What I like here, yeah, exactly. And this was the most polite difference between millennials and boomers that I could find. What I like here about this is that the young man is actually looking up from his laptop, whereas the little kid didn't even bother to look up. That sums up dinner time in a nutshell, I think, in many households. What are the differences between millennials and boomers when we talk about changes in generations over time, besides just this easy technological change that's so easy to grasp onto? Well, we can think about some of the driving changes across generations in terms of demographic changes, things like the aging of our country, changes in marriage and fertility rates, the racial composition of the United States. We can think about economic changes as well, unemployment rates, changes in the labor structure of the United States. And last, we can think about place. That we're not living, we don't grow up anymore in one place and spend our entire life there, but we move around, and the places around us are localized. We have individual housing markets, we have individual labor markets, and anyone here who has ever tried to explain to their family members who don't live here exactly what it's like to commute in Washington, D.C., you know exactly what I'm talking about, because they never seem to understand. Wait a minute, your friend lives 3 miles away and it takes you 45 minutes to get there? I don't understand. Are you crawling? No, welcome to Washington, D.C. So let's talk about some of the demographic changes between millennials and boomers. Demographers often say that demography is destiny and that it's very hard to shed our demographic wings and escape what's happening at a population level. The first thing that we hear about in the media all the time is that millennials are the biggest generation ever, and the media loves to repeat that story. It's not true. Let's take a look first at the gray circles. We see on the left-hand side, in 1980, there were 227 million people in the United States. The red circle represents how many boomers. Those were young adults. They were 18 to 34 years old in 1980. That represents the entire boomer generation. There were about 67 million of them in 1980. If you look now today, in 2013, you can see that that red circle has grown a little bit. Those are millennials, the 18 to 34-year-olds today, but the gray circle has grown much larger. So on one hand, you could say, sure, millennials are the largest generation today in terms of sheer numbers, 73 million versus 67 million. But you see that the gray circle has grown much faster than the red circle has. So in reality, baby boomers were the larger generation. And when the media reports to you today that baby boomers are are starting to shrink. Well, yeah, that's true, but that's not an apples-to-apples comparisons with our millennials, because millennials are 18 to 34, and boomers have already started to age up in older adulthood, and some of them we have already lost and have passed away. So that's not exactly fair to compare a young adult population to an older adult population and claim that one is larger than the other. So what we did for Census Explorer is we wanted to compare apples to apples, young adults at the same point in their life course. So we see here that baby boomers have left a much larger footprint on the US population, just in terms of how many of them there are. But we can think about changing demography in another way too, and that's to think about marriage rates. In 1980, 42% of boomers had never been married before. That's 42% of young adults in 1980. That number has jumped to 66% today. So we've gone from 4 in 10 to almost 7 in 10 young adults. And from an economic perspective, this is a very important demographic change, because we often think when young adults get married, they establish their own household. That means oftentimes a mortgage, their first mortgage. It means purchasing all of the things that go along with home ownership. We often think about it in terms of childbearing and all of the costs that go into that as well. So as we see young adults delaying marriage, this demographic change is going to spill over into economic changes as well. As I'll show you in Census Explorer, this national trend doesn't look the same everywhere in the United States. Some places in the United States are still marrying early and marrying often. And other places, like Washington, I'll show you, almost 9 in 10 young adults here have never been married before. It's a different kind of city. There's another way we can think about demographic change, and we can think about it in terms of the changing face of our generations, of how different we are from baby boomers when they were young adults. In 1980, 22% of boomers were minority. Today, that's grown to 43%. Almost every one of these indicators has more or less doubled since 1980. So the share of the young adult population that's foreign-born has gone from 6% to 15%. And the share of the young adult population that speaks another language at home, oh, there we go. The cursor was blocking it at the bottom, has jumped from 11% to 25%. So young adults today look very different. They speak different languages at home. Not necessarily English is the first language that they speak. More young adults today are immigrants. They were born someplace else. And more of them would not report that they are white, non-Hispanic. So this is a changing demographic force in the United States that makes boomers very different from what millennials are. That second wheel, economic forces. We can ask ourselves, are we really better off than our parents? And this is a fundamental question that we think about when we ask about changing generations, because ultimately when we talk about generations, we're really talking about what parents pass on to their children. And this is a core element of our society, asking ourselves this question, are we really better off than our parents? And the answer is yes and no. We could think about it one way in terms of how much young adults are earning. This graph shows the earnings for a full-time, year-round worker compared to 1980. So this is what young adults were making in 1990, 2000, and today compared to the young adult worker in 2000. Yes, and I see a couple of you are actually grimacing at that red bar. So you could say in 2000, things were looking pretty darn good. The young adult in 2000 was making about $1,500 more per year than the young adult was in 1980. Today, not so much, almost $2,000 less each year for a full-time, year-round worker. This is not people who are underemployed. This is not people who are part-time wishing that they had full-time work. So are we better off? Is my generation better off than my parents? At this graph, no, we can't really say that we are. But we'll come back to that with Census Explorer, because some of us are really doing much better than our parents. If we're earning less, this explains the difference in poverty rates in the United States. Whoops. Sorry about that. Thought I could get zoom in just a little bit more for you. In 1980, 14% of young adults were living at or below the poverty line. Today, that's 20%. So the poverty rate in the United States for young adults has increased significantly. That goes in line with the drop in earnings for this generation as well. But the irony, or what's not exactly intuitive, is that we're also better educated. Millennials are more likely to have a college degree. 22% of them have a college degree. Compared to their parents, only 16% had a college degree there. So on the one hand, we are better educated, but we're also poorer, and we're more likely to be living in poverty. How can this seemingly contradictory story describe the millennial generation? That's because place matters. These are national stories that we're telling. What this map shows are county-level data for poverty rates of children in the United States, where darker colors represent higher levels of poverty. There are some fascinating geographic trends. We can see a belt of high concentrations of poverty through the South, through the Appalachian Mountains, in the Plain States, where we might not have necessarily expected. Does anyone have a guess, those dark circles up in South Dakota and North Dakota? Indian reservations. All right. So we think about how place matters, and that the national story for poverty might not necessarily be the same thing that's played out at the local level. And that was one of the driving forces behind Census Explorer, is that yes, we wanted to talk about millennials today. We wanted to talk about the new generation that is entering the workforce, that is getting a college degree, that is considering marrying and having children. But we wanted to be able to tell a fuller story and compare them to baby boomers when they were young adults, to see really how places have changed over time. This is the interactive tool, the mapping tool that Census has put out in conjunction with Social Explorer, the folks up at out of New York City, and in conjunction with the Minnesota Population Center at the University of Minnesota. What you're going to see here with this tool, and actually before I start that, I'm just going to point out the homage to the changing generations with the little tribute to our technology and how we have listened to music over time. Not only has the music changed, but the technology has gotten progressively smaller. So you can see the three generations. Steve Jobs would be so proud there with that last one. What we did here for Census Explorer, and you can find it just by Googling Census Explorer or Census Explorer Young Adults, is create an interactive map. There we go. The first thing that you'll see when you load it is a map of the United States. You'll have different geographic levels in the upper right-hand corner than you can look at, but I think a good test of what this tool offers is to give us a concrete example, and what better place to choose than where we're living right now, Washington, D.C. So let's take a look and see how Washington compares. So we'll zoom into Washington. And when you select Washington, a series of indicators will come up on the bottom. Now, I'll walk through the indicators in 1 minute, but the first thing I wanted to point out to you, the first indicator that we have is just the proportion of the population in that area that's a young adult. And what we see right here, DC has a reputation for being a young person's city. Over a third of the population in DC is between 18 and 34 years old. For the United States as a whole, it's about 1/4. But you also see, if you look over time, that blue bar going back to 1980, DC has been a young person's city for quite a while, which might not necessarily come to mind if you think about all of what we read in the newspaper for Washington, D.C. today. So we see that this has been a trend in this area for quite a while. Let's open up the full report, and let's see what other characteristics we have. In the upper corner, you can see a full list of characteristics in Census Explorer, including the population, median earnings, whether or not they live in their parents' household, whether or not they're living in poverty, they've never been married, and a whole host of other things like veteran status, whether or not they drive a car when they commute to work. Let's take a look at those median earnings. Now remember what we said the average was, or the median in this case, for the United States. I will show you in a table, since there we go. So you see for the United States as a whole, median earnings are about $34,000, but in Washington, D.C., the typical young adult here earns $54,000, almost $20,000 more than young adults in other areas. In 1980, that wasn't necessarily the case. And we see that young adults in Washington, D.C. were about on par with young adults in other areas of the United States. The power here, I think, is being able to look at the mapping tool. So I'll load the mapping tool in the upper right, and then so we get a little closer view, I'll expand the map. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, you have different geographies that you can look at: county level, metropolitan areas, and tracts. Tracts are kind of a census term for a neighborhood. They're not quite that small, depending on the geography or the area of the United States you're looking at, but this is kind of like a neighborhood. So let's switch to the tract view, and let's take a look in 1980. We can see right away, darker areas are where young adults are earning more money. We can see that this is concentrated west of the city, north of the city, and east of the city. Take a look out here in the northwest around Leesburg and Loudoun County, and we can see as we change from 1980 and we move the timeline to 1990, those areas start to darken, and that goes along with some of our experience of this area, the development that came with Dulles, with the Dulles Corridor, and all of the development out in Loudoun County. We move to 2000, and you'll notice a substantial darkening in the suburbs. These areas here around Tyson's and the Tech Corridor. If we hover over this area, this census tract, we can see young adults who are living there were earning about $85,000 a year compared to $45,000 for the District of Columbia and $37,000 for the United States in 2000. But let's zoom in and take a look at the district, because I think this is an interesting geographic story. You can pretty much draw a north-south line through that diamond, pretty much from the Capitol all the way north to Tacoma Park and south down towards Anacostia. Areas where young adults are doing better and areas where young adults are not doing so great. There's a few pockets right in Capitol Hill where you could see they're definitely outliers. But watch what happens. Watch the geographic pattern change when we advance just 10 years. That geographic pattern has now switched. We see Capitol Hill, young adults there are earning a lot more money, and also in the Northeast. That geographic pattern has moved pretty much north-south to a new geographic boundary in D.C., the Anacostia River. I'll show you again. 2000. So we can see, and this goes with some of our experiences, some of what the newspaper reports, some of the neighborhoods where we could talk about gentrifying, new restaurants that are opening, new luxury condos. That the places, the neighborhoods in DC where young adults are doing better are changing, and this is just a change in 10 years. We could think about some of the other indicators as well. Let's take a look at never married. Over 80% of young adults in Washington, D.C. have never been married before. But we can see that this has gone up over time compared to baby boomers when they were young adults. Although in this case, again, we see Washington, D.C. has always been a little bit of an outlier, at least for the last 2 generations. Let's take a look, though, at that map. We'll expand it again, and we'll take a look at the tracks. 1980. We see this is time it's concentrated inside the District of Columbia, where many young adults have not been married before. That's because this demographic change, not being married, is not necessarily a linear curve with income. So we see that young adults delay marriage at the low level, at the lower end of the ladder for income, when they don't necessarily have a good job, when they don't have a steady paycheck, but they also delay marriage at the upper levels of the income too, as they're trying to finish their college degree and establish a stable career first before they get married. So here we see this play out in some of the geographic areas of Washington, D.C. Notice how much darker the map will become. Now a trend that you would have said, well, that describes mostly D.C., is moving out to the suburbs. And finally, today. Now we have some of the suburbs that are a little lighter in color. And again, this might match some of our experiences, that the young adults, at least in Census Explorer, that are in their late 20s or early 30s, they might not necessarily be purchasing houses in DC to start their family. They might be moving to the suburbs where, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but maybe where housing is just a little bit less expensive than in Washington. But what I want to show here, instead of just looking at the city, let's draw this back out. We'll reset it to 1980. We'll zoom out and take a look at some trends in the United States. And you can see the geography change as we zoom out of this tool. Let's take a look at the county levels. So here we have most of the East Coast stretching out into the Midwest a little bit. Remember, lighter colors here represent that more young adults have been married before. Right? So this is 1980. This is when the boomers were young adults. This is when they were getting married. They were having children. And we can see most of the United States, this map, it's pretty light colored. Many of the boomer generation had already been married. Not necessarily they were still married, but they had already been married. What does that look like today? The map is substantially darker in just one generation. And not just DC, the DC trends here have disappeared and have been swallowed up into an entire northeast corridor where young adults seem to be putting off marriage. You can see areas around Massachusetts, New York City, New Jersey, Philadelphia. Some of these counties here have young adults in excess of 70 and 80% of the share of the young adult population there have never been married before. Where is it different? It's different in the Plains states. It's different in Utah. So we can think about different demographic forces in Utah that might be different from the rest of the nation. We think about Kansas. And then again, we have the West Coast. So in this regard, you could say, well, the West Coast looks more like the East Coast. This gives us a powerful tool because when you back up that generation and you look at what my parents were doing, this was much more of a national story for baby boomers having been married. This was a story that we could talk about more or less a whole generation having experienced this type of demographic trend, instead of today where there's much more complexity, much more variation. I want to give you one more example. Instead of just looking at Washington, D.C., let's take another example that's in our national story right now, and let's talk a little bit about Detroit. So we'll close out of this. Right now we're comparing the District of Columbia. Let's go back to the United States as a whole. And we'll go to the Detroit-Dearborn area. Here we see a little bit different trend. The first thing we can notice when we look here is that there are fewer young adults that are living in Detroit compared to the rest of the population. So one of the things I want to focus about this tool, and to be careful how you explain it or maybe talk about it with other people, we're not necessarily saying that place causes you to look like this. We're not saying that if you just move to Washington, D.C., you'll suddenly be rich and have a college education. No. That's not what we're saying. We're saying is that young adults here are they're not just static. right? So there are migration forces. People are moving to where there are local jobs, or we're talking about a local job market, a local housing market, and they bring whatever characteristics they have with them, plus some characteristics of the places where they're actually living. So it's not just you will move to this place and suddenly you will become like that. The forces are a little more complex than that, so I don't want to necessarily convey that message, that if you just moved there, everything will be rosy and sunny and we'll all live happily ever after and hold hands. That's not exactly what we want to show with the tool. We want to show how the places have changed in conjunction with the people that are living there. So let's look at that full report, and let's pull up earnings. Let's start in 1980, and let's take a look at the tract. All right, so there's Detroit and some of the surrounding counties. So we can see that in 1980, Detroit definitely had pockets of poverty, or in this case, young adult poverty, because they had lower earnings than the rest of the United States, and you can see that the surrounding suburbs, young adults were doing much better there. And by 1990, you can see that some of that poverty in Detroit has started to move out into the suburbs. But now let's talk about it post-recession. And so not only do we see here that there's a hollowing out of Detroit, but we see that that has expanded into many of the suburbs in the outlying areas. And so you can think about some of the demographic trends. Who's employed in that area? Where have those young adults gone? On the flip side of the coin, looking at poverty, we can see some of the same trend here, and the one that I want to point out is the 2000 one. That young adults in Detroit in 2000 were below average in terms of number of young adults that were living below poverty. Today, they're above average compared to the United States as a whole. So one of the goals that we wanted to do with the Census Explorer tool was to be able to look at data at the local level and see how it has changed over time, to compare millennials today as they're young adults to their parents, to the baby boom generation when they were young adults. If the data inspire you and if they interest you, you can download them up here. When you load Census Explorer, there's a download option for data that's available at the United States level, the nation level, the state, metropolitan areas, all counties in the United States, and census tracts in the United States. There's a definition, there's code books and variable lists for definitions. How exactly did we code full-time employment? How exactly did we code median earnings? So you can get more information about that there. And if you use it in your presentations, there's also an option that you can share some of the maps and some of the graphs. And so what we wanted to do with this was to be able to provide a tool that could be used quickly and easily, because let me tell you, Census has a lot of data. A lot of data. We're up to our eyeballs in data, and we wanted to help create a platform that would make it easier for users to grasp that data, to look at some broad trends very quickly, but also drill right down so that you could take it to a stakeholder, perhaps to a business, perhaps to a staffer, and be able to say, this is what it looks like when you go home, and this is how it's changed over time for you. So I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me here to talk, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have about what we've talked about today. Thank you. Are you, oh, there's a microphone, okay.
Thank you for being here today. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. My question is, you focused a lot on the local, and that was really informative. What implications does the national have on local areas? For example, with the DC area, you showed a graphic of tremendous white flight during the 80s, and again, the period of the boomers. And then, as we know, millennials are a little bit more diverse. We see DC now, and the entire area has gentrified and it's changed, and it looks like different people are living in, there's a migration back to the cities.
Mm-hmm.
And so what implication does that have on diversity and the impact of mixing groups within Washington, D.C. there? Is it a millennials versus boomers argument in that as well, in the 80s versus the 90s demographic of just Washington, D.C. as well?
Millennials versus the boomers. It sounds like they're going to go into a celebrity death match. I like that. One of the interesting things that you could see if you look at the tool is how many young adults are living in Florida. And you think about that for a second, you're going, well, wait a minute, but Florida is where everyone goes when they retire. And yet Florida has a local trend for young adults that in some ways may mirror the trend for older adults. And so I think if we just think about juxtaposing the generations, we lose some of that change over time because the demographic forces are happening at the same time. So this country is getting older. There are more older adults, and the boomers are aging up into retirement. And there's been a lot of talk lately about whether or not they're downsizing their houses, are they leaving the suburbs and going back to cities? And so what we see is some of this trend is for young adults, but I think older adults are leading this trend as well as they experience an empty nest syndrome and they don't need a 4-bedroom house anymore. We've seen increases in multi-generational households at the national level. We've seen tremendous increases in young adults older adults who are living alone. They're not living with other family members. We just released a data product yesterday that looks at the change in living arrangements for the entire segment of the population back to the 1960s. And older adults today are much more likely to be living alone than with family members. So I think you could say that some of those trends that we see at the national level are being played out by both generations at the local level. And so that is going to be, we get calls pretty routinely from realtors that are looking for housing data, that are trying to look for this next trend. Is this going to be multi-generational housing they're looking to build? Is this going to be rental units that they're looking to build? So I think, yeah, you see that those trends play out on both angles.
I'm curious as to why are the incomes for millennials so high in this city?
It's expensive. If you look at it from 1980 to 1990, you see that the incomes don't change. Well, these are earnings. These aren't incomes. So you'll see that the earnings don't change a whole lot. And then starting in 2000, they change very quickly. So DC has a pretty specific job market, and it's driven largely by the federal government. And you can think about the technology sector, technology contractors, defense contractors that picked up in the 2000s after 9/11, and then has continued for the last 14 or 15 years. So I think that's one reason why we want to be careful saying that it's about the place necessarily and not just the people, that it's a combination of them, because DC has a labor market that would be very difficult to replicate in other parts of the country. So we don't see that trend necessarily elsewhere. But also keep in mind that the cost of living here is higher. So these data do not account for a cost of living change. That would be hard to do. It does account for inflation, but it does not account for a cost of living.
So I just had a quick question about the actual definition you're using for millennials and how much consternation there was in terms of your data set. Particularly, I mean, I'm sure it was huge, but the question is really one out of curiosity of distinguishing between millennials who would have graduated and entered the workforce before the recession and those afterwards, which I would imagine would throw even more severe trends in income variances, et cetera. I don't know if there's been much debate about that.
There was much gnashing of teeth to figure out what a millennial was. And let me tell you, this is not the only definition. It's really easy to define baby boomers because you mark them by the change in fertility rate. In 1946, there was a spike in the fertility rate following World War II, and that fertility rate did not reach pre-World War II levels until 1964. It's very easy to define that generation. They were defined by a demographic event. Millennials were like, I don't know, I mean, maybe there's still people born in so there was much gnashing of teeth as to what a millennial was. We picked 18 to 34 between 2009 and 2013 to be sure that there were no boomers in that age range left anymore. And yes, you're spot on with these data overlapping with the Great Recession. You're spot on with that. What we would hope to do is add on data points to this tool so that we can then get beyond that recovery from the recession. A lot of the data is already available through the American Community Survey down to the local level. It's just not in this tool.
I've really enjoyed your presentation so far, and I think
Thank
this
you.
is a great tool that Census has made. I'm just wondering if there's plans right now to have other map tools like this, but looking at different demographic trends, not just from baby boomers to millennials, but maybe other demographic changes such as where like minorities are settling or any other different maps that are future plans for Census.
So a lot of these data, the data for today come from the American Community Survey, and those data are available down to the local level. So you can get census tracts, but you can get principal cities, you can get congressional districts. We did not do. The reason why we picked these demographic trends is because we had them available back to 1980. So as soon as you start going back in time, the data, it becomes hard to find data that's measured exactly the same way, that's a real apples to apples comparison. But if you're looking for a broader range of demographic, economic characteristics, social characteristics, and you want to be able to look at it at the local level, American Community Survey.
We have a WebEx question. You touched on the cost of living a bit, but how do you incorporate debt and other costs of living into assessing whether or not millennials are better off than their parents?
We did not look at it for that tool for exactly the reason that I said, is that we don't have a good time trend of data to go back to 1980 and look at what my parents' generation did in terms of debt, how much they graduated with, how much credit card debt that we had. The data was just very limited. So for this tool, we picked the cleanest possible comparison, which was to look at earnings. Income involves other characteristics like wealth data, which we just didn't have available to us. So for this, we kept it clean as comparison as possible so we could get a true apples to apples comparison. For looking at debt though, that's got a lot of media attention lately, and there is good work that's being done about whether or not young adults are delaying marriage and delaying having children because of high levels of debt that they carry. But I think the safest thing to say is that the jury is still out. Some studies find that young adults are putting off childbearing while they pay down debt, and some studies are finding that it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. So the jury is still out on that one.
Great, and I think you just sort of answered the next question, which is, what do you think the biggest implication of young adults not marrying now and in the future is?
Wow, if I could answer this question, I could write a book and then I could retire. Probably every demographer in the United States is trying to grapple with this question of whether or not young adults are going to marry. Right now, the median age for marriage in the United States is almost 30 for men. For my parents' generation, my mom and dad, they were married and they had their first child at 23, and my mom was 22. And I think about that, I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Was I ready at 22? That's a huge demographic change in just a single generation. I think the take-home message from those changes, though, it's not that young adults are never marrying, they're putting it off. And the fascinating demographic trend here is that a generation ago, marriage was something that boomers did to reach in order to reach young adulthood, in order to reach adulthood. It was part of the process of growing up. It was a building block to show that you're an adult. And today, just one generation later, that has gone from being a building block to a capstone experience. That marriage is something you do once you have the job, once you have the house, once you have paid down the debt, once you feel economically secure. And so marriage has become, in some ways, a status marker. It's the capstone experience that young adults look for now. And that's why we see some of that delay.
Any other questions in the room? Anyone? Well, someone says they have a comment, not a question for you. The tool is excellent and they like it. They are 34, but they don't consider themselves a millennial. They love to see the tool have the age be a variable rather than fixed.
I agree.
Thoughts on that? Yeah. All right, and so no one else in the room. All right, I think you've saturated everyone with information, and our WebEx people are sending comments and applause.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it, and I'll be happy to stay after and answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.